Well, thank you so much for your time talking to me today. Um, I wanted to ask you, first of all, for a quick introduction on who you are and what you do. Yes.
Thanks, Laurencia. My name is Brad Balliett, and I'm a musician based in New York City. And my work kind of falls into three big buckets. I'm a composer. I write a lot of music, especially chamber music for mixed ensembles, but also things for orchestra, for chorus, and for other combinations. I'm a bassoon player. I'm a freelance bassoonist, so I play in a lot of different orchestras and I play a lot of chamber music as well. And I'm a teacher. I teach bassoon at the Peabody Institute in Baltimore. And I also spend a lot of time working with incarcerated musicians in prisons and jails across the country. So between those two things, it's a good variety of different things that are all linked by music.
Mm. Amazing. Thank you so much for that. And well, it's interesting that you have such a vibrant, performing career, for a composer. I want to ask, like, how does your how does your experience as a performer inform you better as a composer? Do those things like intertwine in the process?
That's a really good question. I think that it's sort of a matter of historical record that there was a time not so long ago that the difference between performer and composer was not such a wide gulf. It was only in the mid 20th century that this specialization has come about. I think most of the great composers that we love from the established Western classical music canon were performers as well and improvisers too. When I was growing up, a lot of my musical heroes were people that were both composers and performers and improvisers as well. People like Jörg Widmann, um, Heinz Holliger, and even people like John Coltrane and Charlie Parker, who are great composers that are also phenomenal players. But most of all, I just didn't want to choose. I love playing the bassoon. I love performing. I don't ever see a time in my life when that won't be an important thing to me. But my favorite thing of all is creating new music. So if there's any way to combine that for a career, I will always choose that option. What I
Right.
love about anybody that's a performer composer is kind of like the feeling that you're working with something that is a physical act also. So I think it's important for composers to really think about how it feels to play the music, whether that's about the breath or about the fingers, or just the creation of the sound. But it gives a kind of different angle when composers are coming up with their ideas.
Wow. Well, that's a really insightful answer, and I like that you mentioned John Coltrane. He's one of my favorite jazz composers. Yeah. And um, so do you find that like in your composing, like sometimes your experience as a bassoon performer, like I wanted to ask because I'm not a composer myself, but I'm like really interested. Like, does it sometimes like is it does it help you in some way? Like, if you wanted to write a piece for orchestra, does knowing like like kind of knowing the bassoon and knowing like performance and just all of that like help you in any way like or influence any of your composition processes?
Oh, for sure, without a doubt. A lot of the composers that I know that are not performers will really do a lot of work to make sure that they have a little bit of experience just trying out instruments from each of the families. And that's so important to sort of understand, like, what does it feel like to try to play a high note on a brass instrument or to try to play like a technical passage on the violin? And that's all critical stuff. I think for me, it certainly leads me to write more music for wind instruments because they're the instruments that I have the most experience with. But spending so much time playing in ensembles and sitting through the rehearsal process also gives me a little bit of an insight into one, what's fun to play and what different players really enjoy playing. I think it's really nice when a composer will do something that's idiomatic, is the word we use, like plays to the strengths of the instrument. It's usually more fun that way. Um, but also sort of like what sounds good, like the combinations of different registers and all that kind of thing. And I'd say you don't have to be a performer to get to know those things, but spending time inside that world just gives a little bit of an advantage.
Mm.
I'd say the one thing that eh, maybe composers that are not performers have the advantage on is sort of the total freedom of imagination of not being affiliated with any instrument, that you can let your mind run wild and be like, well, what if I tried to make an instrument do something that's really outside of the norm for what they do? Now you might run into problems that way. The players might say, well, you're asking me for something that's not really possible or is very, very difficult. Um, but I think both approaches have their place in new music in particular.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was talking to Jeffrey Mumford the other day, and he said the exact same thing. He was like, when I get a commission, I look for um kind of what could highlight that each instrument's best qualities, and yeah, I think that's really important. Not only for the composer but also for the performer. It makes it so much easier. Like, more about your composition process. I wanted to ask, like, what is your inspiration? Usually when you get a commission or you get an idea, like, how does it start?
Um, Good question. One that's always a little bit difficult to answer. I draw a lot of inspiration from my other interests, literature and the natural world, especially. And recently, I've grown to really love exploring the outdoors and especially watching wildlife. And it's such an incredibly rich topic that many composers have explored before. And enough so that I know a lot of composers sort of avoid the topic altogether. They're like, well, that's been done so many times. But of course, the natural world is infinite in its interests. And what I really love about birdsong in particular is that it's a kind of natural folk music that belongs to all people. Everybody that lives around birds can experience birdsong and sort of relate it to their life in whatever way is meaningful for them. So it's a very open concept that any composer could approach and do something meaningful with. I do think a lot about both the instruments I'm writing for and the people that I'm writing for. Like when I just think of just writing a melody, it's almost too terrifying, like the huge range of options that are available. But if I think of writing a melody for a clarinet, like suddenly the world starts making a lot more sense. And I think about like what I would want to hear that instrument doing, and things just happen a little bit quicker.
Mm.
Um, I do a lot of my composing at the piano or at the bassoon because I like to be able to touch and feel the music as I'm making it. So even if I'm writing a piece for the flute, I might write it on the bassoon, and that might be that I write down some snippets of melody that I'm interested in, and I'll do a lot of improvisation. Then I'll listen back through and choose the areas that I like the most, and then put some order and logic and form to what I've written.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, that's really cool. And I'm wondering, like, in your process of like, just like you said, like writing a piece for flute, for example, do you use some kind of technology in like transcribing it, like, and listening back for flute, or how do you hear the flute?
Um, it's sometimes some of each. A lot of times I will sing melodies for myself, record it, and then listen back. Or if I am working with another sort of natural phenomenon like birdsong, I'll listen and try to transcribe it at the piano. But I also often will bring a sample like that into a DAW like Ableton and slow it down so that I can hear a little bit more of the detail and listen in a loop so
Mhm.
that it makes it both easier to transcribe and also pull out some of the interesting rhythmic aspects of it. I'll do that also, even if I've just improvised something with bassoon, I might bring it into a software so I can cut it into pieces, try moving little bits around the way somebody would if they were making pop music.
Mm.
Um, I'm very influenced by pop music in general, both as a fan, but also as a member of a band that works collaboratively to make music that's it sort of straddles the world between indie pop music and classical music. And composing collaboratively is very, very different than working on your own. It requires much more willingness to cede control and combine ideas, but you can get some results that you would obviously never get on your own as well.
That's super interesting because it feels like pop music and classical music are like completely different worlds, but you're combining all both of them. And
I
nice.
sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, I actually remember just to add to the nature part of like your inspiration, like watching a video for by the University of Michigan. It was like the Arboretum. Is that how you say it?
The Arboretum,
Arboretum,
yeah.
and it was done. I remember it was done in like an outside setting, so you could hear the nature and also the music as well, the instrument music as well, and that was super interesting. So I really like that.
The fun thing with that piece is that it's kind of 15 different solo pieces going on simultaneously. So each bassoonist is attached to a species of tree and they're standing by that tree and playing the song of that tree. But the pieces all work together so that it creates a kind of slow motion chord sequence. So somebody that's sort of standing in the forest as an audience member between all these bassoons is sort of just getting this wash of sound from all the solo pieces interacting. That's a concept I've been experimenting with because you get so much rhythmic freedom and complexity, but you can write as the composer really very simple rhythms because it's the non-synchronization of these several things working together that makes music that's very human but very complex at the same time. So maybe it's a little bit of a shortcut to complexity, but I really like the way those things interact.
No, that's super
Um,
interesting. I've never heard of anyone doing that.
it's kind of a John Luther Adams thing. He does that in some of his pieces, like his piece 10,000 Birds, which I don't know very well, but is a piece I know uses a similar formal construct.
Mhm.
But I wanted to circle back to something you said about pop music and classical music often feeling like they're living in two very different spaces, which I agree with. But I I really believe, and I think it's a very positive thing. And I'll be curious as you talk with more and more composers, if they express something similar or something different, because people feel very differently about this topic. But most of the young kind of cutting edge composers that are working now are like, they're no longer trying to write abstract, abrasive music of the type that characterized music from the generations before me, people like Elliot Carter, Brian Ferneo, Harrison Birtwistle. I love that music, but that's the music that a lot of people sometimes feel like gives contemporary music its reputation as being difficult and that audiences have a hard time engaging with. Composers now are writing music that's not any less profound or interesting, but music that the audience can um, engage with immediately, music that we might describe as popular. And I think there's going to be this great melding, I hope, where most of the divisions fall away and concert music is sort of similar to all other music.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a super interesting take. And yeah, it makes so much sense. What do you think about like film music? And I feel like a lot of people are doing like game music, like video game music, like composing nowadays. Like,
I make absolutely no judgments about the quality of music based on the style or utility of the music. I think everybody has their own personal code of what they respond to, and it's irresponsible to say that one person's code is more valid than another. It's a problem in classical music that there are like sort of hallowed tastemakers that say that this is superior music, or that because of somebody's life experience, they're writing better music than another. I'm sure that there are video game composers who are writing music that's every bit as complex and moving as somebody that's writing just chamber music or
Yeah.
just country music or just hip hop music. And certainly uh, um, there's music in all genres that I count among my favorite music of all time.
Mhm. Yes, I totally agree. And yeah, and I like I've gone to a concert actually where it was like an orchestra and they were playing all game music and I thought that was cool. I just wanted to add. Um,
Video Games Live. I love that show. I played that a couple of times with some different orchestras.
That's so cool. And yeah, and yeah, I like think I totally agree with everything you just said. Like, classical music, like some people like say, oh, like this is better than like this composer, like their life experiences like show like more complexity or more emotion than others, and what's better and whatnot. And like there's lots of that's one of the like issues in the classical music industry, but yeah, and so I wanted to like first of all thank you for like putting that out. Like I think that's really important for listeners to know. And I want to let you know I already also agree with it. And yeah. So
Yeah, there's like I mean, this is like a sort of constant attitude that you see among young players, young composers, and audience members too. But everybody's allowed to have their own taste. Like you're allowed to say, I like this and I don't like that.
yeah,
Uh, the danger comes when somebody starts talking about, oh, this is not uh, real music versus this, or that something is objectively better than something else.
yep,
Like there is objectivity goes away as soon as we start talking about art. I think it doesn't really exist.
absolutely. Yes. And also, okay, now I want to switch a little bit towards um you said earlier that you bring music to correctional facilities, right? And non-traditional settings. I remember like looking in your website, you were working with projects like Music Cambia and Music Heals Us, and I want to ask you a little bit about how you came to, pursue that, and what kind of thoughts you've had about that and what experiences you had through that.
Sure, I'm always happy to talk about this aspect of my career, which is growing, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to become involved in this if it's something that's meaningful for them. I started with it through Carnegie Hall. I had done a fellowship called Ensemble Connect, and Carnegie Hall has a program called Musical Connections that puts groups of all different genres in a lot of different places. And through that, a chamber group I was in was placed on a project at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. I was very inspired by that work, and even more importantly, some of my colleagues were and began their own projects in a couple different facilities. I quickly learned that I found the work very meaningful and interesting, and I've been doing it for over 10 years now in over a dozen different prisons. The number one, I mean, a lot of these programs have different goals. For me, the biggest goals are to give somebody a chance at self-expression, to have the experience of hearing their artistic ideas come to life, and to build skills of collaboration and community. Um, Very, very secondary to that is teaching musical skills. Some people that participate in these projects are really hungry for like just straight up kind of knowledge and facts like music theory and composing skills and tips. But other people are there for other reasons. the community, even just for a place that feels safe or for a place where they can focus on something else than the normal things of their day to day. And over time, I've come to realize that these programs don't really solve the problems that are inherent in the prison system in the US, but they do provide temporary relief from them and can occasionally build skills that are instrumental either in helping somebody to become free if they're staying in the prison, sometimes to help them get out of prison because this work can bolster somebody's file for parole hearings and things like that. And there's a lot of skills that can be useful for people watching society on the outside. Um, the uh, 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 from incarcerated people that most of the world doesn't get the chance to see. So
Mm.
anymore, whenever I have the chance to program a concert, I really prioritize putting on some music from incarcerated composers just so that we keep them in our conversations and in our thoughts.
Yeah, that's no, that's so touching and such an inspirational story. And I wanted to ask about that specifically because Klexical, right now, we are also trying to, I'm not incarcerated people, but to go to underserved communities and children specifically because they're the future they're the future, right? And so I want to, give them a chance to compose or learn about contemporary music or, learn about robots playing music or AI playing music. I think it's just a really fun, thing for kids to learn. And I've been thinking of like developing a program to bring to um places around communities around me and children around me. And I thought what you were doing with your work was so inspirational. And I wanted to ask, like, when you teach um when you teach these like workshops, is this is for the sake of my project, like to help me, but is it over like multiple sessions that how do you like do you use like a curriculum to teach them how to compose and music theory, like how does it work?
Excellent question, and I'm glad you're interested in this kind of work, both because it is important, as you say, and also there's just a huge opportunity for young musicians to both give back to their communities and get paid to do it,
Yes.
because there's a lot of funding available for this kind of stuff if you can look in the right place. Um, in terms of the um, in terms of the uh, prison projects specifically, they take a lot of forms. Like at Sing Sing, our teaching artists are there every other week through the academic calendar year. So it's an ongoing thing, and they have long-term projects, and we're checking in with them all the time. A lot of our projects are kind of songwriting based, and those will take place over the course of like 4 or 5 days, and we'll be with them every day for several hours working on the project. And then on the last day, we'll have some sort of culminating event like a concert. And maybe at a facility, we'll have a week like that once, twice, or maximum 3 times a year, something like that. So there's a lot of different ways that you can set it up, and they all have their pros and cons. On the one hand, you have sort of like this incredible injection of like goodwill and creativity all at once. But there's a danger there because it can leave a little bit of a vacuum when you go, which is why I think it's important whenever possible to do projects that have no real end date. They're relationships. They go on for as long as you can. On the other hand, the sort of more ongoing thing, like you can get into more in-depth work and really watch somebody's progress the
Yes.
whole time.
Yeah.
I try not to think of it as teaching. I think of this as more like facilitation. Like, unless somebody asks specifically, can you show me this, or how would you do this? It's more about bringing your participants' ideas to life in a collaborative manner.
Mm.
And when you're working with young people, especially very young people, certainly there's a little bit more of a teaching aspect to it because you're building a vocabulary and a method for working. But I think the same underlying principle is true, which is at the first moment possible, you want to hand the creative reins to your participants so that they're in charge of not only what the music's going to sound like, but what the project is. Like, what do you and your cohort of people, like, what are you trying to do here? And how can we help you to make that vision come true? Now, if it's like third graders, like, sure, yeah, you want to give a more structure and a little bit more of a like a focus
Mm,
because that makes it easier to get started.
mm. Okay, well, that's super helpful.
Does
Thank you
that-
so much. Okay, now I started this project because I found that a lot of people like my age had the stigma for contemporary music, right? And so I wanted to ask you, you started off as a bassoonist, right? Or how did
Mhm.
you start off? You started off as a bassoonist. How did you get into composing? And like, did you have this kind of like presumptive idea about contemporary music? Like, how did you get into it?
Interesting question. I actually started composing before I ever played the bassoon. I started composing simultaneously with when I started playing an instrument. It
Wow.
just, I never saw the separation between the two. If I was going to be playing an instrument, I wanted to be making up my own music for it. So my first instrument actually was the violin, and I stopped practicing after age 10 or something like that because I had found instruments and it's what I wanted to do. But there was never a question in my mind uh, at all, one, that I would be a musician, two, that I would be composing and playing. They were always the same thing. That
Mm,
said, I always knew that I wanted to go to college to study performance. This was maybe a little bit of like my paranoid brain as a child, if I could have performance as the cornerstone of it. I'm not positive I would say that to anybody starting now. I mean, there's a million ways to make a living in music, and I think the more sort of varied your career can be, the safer you'll feel as you're starting this journey. Um, in terms of contemporary music, I always had my tastes, as anybody does growing up. I found contemporary music that I liked
mm.
when I was in high school. I was a big fan of minimalism. I loved Philip Glass and Michael Nyman and Steve Reich and stuff like that. Very typical stuff for high schoolers, at least of my
Yeah.
generation. They're like, oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Um, it wasn't in, um, but I recall that a very formative moment for me was I went to Tangwood after my senior year of college. And all through college, I listened to, some difficult music, but mostly from like the modernist school. I wasn't listening to a lot of very, very sort of avant-garde music. And I got a part for this piece by Birtwhistle in the mail that I was going to play that summer. And I looked at the rhythms and I thought, this is crazy. Like no composer can like really thinks that way. This looks so haphazard. I didn't understand it. Um, but as soon as we started rehearsing, I just felt absolutely in love with it. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. So at that time, I decided that I would dedicate myself to learning a lot more about contemporary music. And it became a big part of what I wanted to do as a bassoonist.
Mm,
Um, so I went out of my way to try to meet more people that were interested in contemporary music and joined some contemporary music ensembles.
mm,
And it's become a huge part of my life. I still love playing the classics, but if I had to choose one thing as a performer, it would be playing new music.
same.
It's just
And
exciting.
yeah, and it feels like the interpretation is more original, like no influence, just pure, your thought. And
You have much more of a chance to affect the course of music history
mm,
this way, both by championing pieces and composers that you believe in, and because you get to be, it's just a privilege to be part of that process. like to get to premiere a piece, for instance, by Augusta Reed Thomas. It doesn't mean that my version is going to be the permanent version, but it's an honor to be the first one to get to
Absolutely.
realize a piece of music in that way.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm exactly the same because I mean, I think experiences are really like what gets you to into contemporary music because I would listen to contemporary music, but I wasn't really into it until I actually played the piece and I fell in love with it. And then I really enjoyed listening, like exploring contemporary music. Um, and so yeah, that's also like kind of that brings up a concern for me. Like I know my platform is kind of an educational resource, but I also don't know like if it's an experience enough to make people like change people's perspectives. I
That's
mean,
a very astute concern because it's like you say, it's like playing an instrument is a physical activity, and there's a kind of athleticism to it that somebody watching a concert, it's hard to for them to understand exactly what you're going through on stage.
mhm,
But uh, for one thing, it should inspire us to find new ways to engage with audiences. And it also shouldn't prevent us from exploring all the other avenues available. So I think I applaud what you're doing, even just to have you as a young person advocating for this music. Like that's enough. That's enough to bring some people along, and who knows what sort of ripple effect something like that can have.
hopefully. Yeah, well, I think that was all the questions I had. Yep. I want
My only request is that you keep me posted, Lancia, with how your project's going, because I'm very interested to see what you'll do with all of this.
I will. I honestly like I've been thinking this could really turn out to be like you said, like not the best way to approach this project is not to see the end date, you know, like keep going and maybe it'll become a lifelong project. I don't know. I don't know.
I think
Well,
that, yeah, and just let me know if I can be of assistance. I'm
yeah.
happy to
Well,
help.
already you've given me so a wealth of knowledge and I want to thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy and it's been so much fun talking to you and I've just learned so much and thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Have a nice rest of your evening, Lancia.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
again.
I'll keep you posted.
All right. So long.
Thank you. Bye bye.